Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paula Marincola. I'm the Executive Director of the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar with our visiting scholar, Linda Earle. This is the fourth and final in a series on archiving Black culture. And before we begin, and I turn the day over to our speakers and Linda, I just want to make the following acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor the land upon which we gather as the ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues today. We take this moment to recognize the original stewards of this land and the histories of violence and erasure that have brought us here. Okay, well, our Director of Exhibitions and Public Interpretation, Kelly Schindler, and the Director of our Artist Fellowships Program, Melissa Franklin, have actually been the forces working with Linda, organizing this series of webinars, and I want to thank them for the outstanding job they've done over the last several months. I am going to turn the afternoon over to them first. They will get us started, introduce Linda and the day. So thank you, and I look forward to what's to come.
Thanks so much, Paula. That's very kind of you. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I just wanted to briefly offer a little context for our work with Linda and her residency here as the Pew Center's visiting scholar over the last year. And in fact, our conversations with Linda, as my colleague Melissa reminded me the other day, they started exactly a year ago this week. At the center, we knew we wanted to explore Black cultural production programmatically as it is central to what we support through our grant making and the equity values we are centering here in our work. And who better to lead the way than with Linda Earle as our guide. Linda's curiosity is boundless, and there are so many angles and windows into cultural practice that she is interested in exploring. This is no surprise given her own impressive and extensive background across an array of practices, from grant making at the New York State Council on the Arts, to her board service at the Jerome and Art Matters Foundations, to her concurrent work as an educator and mentor at the Tyler School of Art at Temple University. After many stimulating brainstorming conversations, Linda decided to focus on the area of Black archives, and the resulting suite of Zoom roundtables organized under the title Archiving Black Culture, Ethics and Practices of Change has brought together archivists, scholars, curators, and artists to explore the work being done to restore Black cultural presence, expand content, and reimagine access. It has been a wonderful learning experience for us at the center, and hopefully to those of you who have been able to join us for these programs. We are so grateful to Linda with her deft moderation skills and the impressive lineup of speakers she has assembled over the course of 4 programs. These culminate in today's conversation with the Nomadic Archivists, Miranda Mims and Stephen Fullwood, as well as an interview with artist and archive enthusiast Colleen Smith that will publish later this fall. And now, Melissa, would you like to say a few words before we turn things over to Linda and her guests?
Sorry, unmute myself. Thanks, Kelly. Yes, before we turn it over to Linda, since this is our last event, we just wanted to extend some gratitude to some folks. First, we wanted to thank all of our colleagues at the center, and especially our colleague Bill Bissell, Director of Performance, who was part of the original thinking around this idea, and our fearless Executive Director, Paula Marincola, for her vision and leadership, and also our communications colleagues, and especially Adam Clare. And lastly, Amaka Eze, who worked behind the scenes tirelessly to make sure all of these Zoom conversations happened and has kept this whole project on track. So thanks, Amaka, for all of that. We also want to just extend our gratitude to the past speakers, Raina Andrews, Simone Fujita, Faith Day, Portia Hopkins, Sinatra Smith, Rujeka Hockley, and to today's guests, Stephen Fullwood and Miranda Mims. And we want to thank all of the visitors and repeat audiences who have attended these events. And of course, lastly, a huge thank you to Linda Earle for her curiosity, her intellect, her collegiality. It's been such a pleasure for me and Kelly to be working with Linda on this project, a real joy. Thanks, Linda. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa, Paula, Kelly, everyone at the center. And I'm so glad you mentioned all of the names. I had them here ready to reel off of all of the participants so far. And the private conversations I've had that have informed this series and my thinking, and our guests today. I'm working on some of the material culled from the private conversations that I'll be writing about and compiling a bibliography and resources that'll be shared in the fall. And this series will be on the website in the fall as well. So the first three programs, if you were able to attend, were really about focus mainly on lifting and elaborating on Black material in mainstream repositories. And for this culminative public program, I wanted to center on the perspectives of our nomadic archivists and their approach to organizing at the grassroots, teaching archival practice to cultural workers, historians, artists, and their communities in their commitment to archival literacy. The people they work with are generating a lot of new knowledge, and how it's preserved, recognized, shared, and really metabolized is, I think, increasingly important. So I'm so looking forward to learning more today. Miranda Mims is currently the Joseph N. Lambert and Harold B. Schleifer, that's correct, Director of Rare Books, Special Collections, and Preservation at the University of Rochester. Miranda is the author of the chapter Archival Futurism. I love that title, Archives as Social Justice, and is co-editing the forthcoming anthology, The Evidence, Black Archivists Holding Memory, which will explore the archival experience across the global Black world. And Stephen G. Fullwood is an archivist, documentarian, and writer. His published works include Black Gay Genius, co-edited with Charles Stevens, To Be Left with the Body, co-edited with Cheryl Clark, Carry the Word, a bibliography of Black LGBTQ books, co-edited with Lisa Moore. He is the former assistant curator of manuscripts, archives, and rare books of that division at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He founded the archive, In the Life Archive, to aid in the preservation of materials produced by the LGBTQ people of African descent. And he was honored with a New York Times Librarian Award in 2005, I wanted to mention. We'll get started in just a minute. I want to hand it over to Amaka for some words about the protocols for the asking questions in the webinar, and with many thanks, Amaka.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, so I'll make this quick. I just wanted to let everyone know that the chat and the Q&A functions are available for participant use. So please feel free to leave comments in the chat as our presenters are speaking and post questions during the Q&A portion of the event. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded live. We'll hand it right back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Amaka. And I'm going to hand it over to Stephen and Miranda, who will present some information and do a presentation about their work as nomadic archivists. And we want to leave some time for your questions and your comments. So I'll hand it over to Miranda and Stephen now.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Give me a second. I hope everyone can hear and see. So welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. We are honored to be a part of the Black Cultural Archive series hosted by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage. I would love to extend my thanks on behalf of Stephen and I to Linda Earle for her work in organizing this discussion, archiving Black culture, artists, community, and alternative archival practices, which will be centered around the work we do at the Nomadic Archivists Project. And a special thanks to the folks at the Pew Center, especially Amaka Eze, for making this happen today.
One moment.
All right.
So again, I'm Stephen G. Fullwood, and thank you so much for inviting us, Linda Earle, and your team at the Pew Center. On behalf of Miranda and I, we put together an energetic, thoughtful, and hopefully engaging presentation today. We hope to bring you into our conversation about the politics and the necessity of saving Black culture, the variety of ways in which we hope to serve our communities. And if we convert one or two of you to become archivists, we'll do that. And so what you can expect today is that we're going to talk a little bit about our paths and the theoretical approaches we have invested in to talk about and deal with and focus on Black communities and archival memory. We're also going to talk about some alternative practices that have been, that are really useful, that open up our imagination about what's possible in terms of archiving our stuff outside of the traditional institutions that do this work. We're also going to let you in on some work that we've been doing with the Nomadic Archivists Project. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some community projects that I've been working on that dovetail nicely with what NAP is trying to do and has been doing for the last couple of years now. So, and of course we want to hear from you, but throughout the conversation, if you have questions, as Amaka said, please use the functions because we want to hear from you. And at the end, we want to look at you, hopefully, if that's a possibility. But yeah, I hope things are good. And so take it away, Miranda.
Well, actually, Stephen, you want to talk about who this gentleman is in the picture?
Yeah, I like a little bit of both. I want to make sure folks are like paying attention, but I'll buy it. I'll do that. So what you see in the picture on the right here, you have David Mitchell, who's the managing director of the Arena Players. And the Arena Players is the longest running local Black theater in the country. They came together, I think, in 1953. And what you see is he's actually boxing up their records. I'll tell you a little bit about the Black Theater Commons and their archival initiative and how I got involved with the Arena Players, but as well as dozens of other Black theaters from 2018 to 2019. So I just wanted to give you a little bait and go, well, what's that about? So, but now you have a little information and I'll be telling you about him later on.
Thanks, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
So as Stephen said, we're going to start with our paths and who we are. And so we like to make things personal because we feel that the work that we do as archivists is personal, and it has a lot of resonance with us as human beings, right? And so we ground ourselves in that perspective. So as Linda mentioned earlier, my name is Miranda Mims, and I am currently the director of Rare Books and Special Collections and Preservation at the University of Rochester. I also co-founded the Nomadic Archivists Project with Stephen. I have been in this profession for over a decade. 7 of those years were spent at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. The Schomburg is one of 4 research centers in the New York Public Library. And this is where I met Stephen. We worked together for many years. And after we both left the center, we formed the Nomadic Archivists Project, which we'll talk about a little later. So one of the things that I have been focused on over the past few years is how archival practices and the archival experience aligns with the philosophies of Afrofuturism. And Afrofuturism imagines a future world with African and African diasporic people in it. And not only are we simply existing in it, but we are, as Florence Okoye says, we are the makers and shapers of it. We show up in complex and diverse ways. The world is, in a sense, a reflection of us. And I see the work I am engaged in, especially now with the Nomadic Archivists Project, being deeply concerned and connected with this premise. A future with archives full of Black voices, our words, our sounds, our creativity, innovation, strength, and wisdom in our history. And I feel that the alternative work, archival work we are discussing here today will ensure this future. One of the alternative models to traditional thinking around archival work is borderless archives. And that's a lot of where the sort of the nomadic title comes from in the Nomadic Archivists Project. So although I have been in this field for over a decade, as I mentioned, it wasn't until 2016 until I started to really begin thinking about this idea of transcending borders. That includes both physical and intellectual borders of how some of the fundamental underpinnings around the ideas around this idea intersected or could intersect with my own work as an archivist. So throughout my career, I've been deeply interested in preserving African diasporic culture and history. I started thinking about that history in relation to space, place, and community. And when I began to explore the idea of borderless archiving, I thought about all the stories out there, historically significant, but outside of the work I was doing or could not engage in because of institutional limitations. The realization of embracing borderless archiving is probably rooted in my own background, as I've always thought of myself as a nomad at heart. I've had the opportunity of living in many states across this country and 3 other continents. And that mobility has been central to the ways in which I interact with the environments I am entering, existing in, or have left behind. It has also provided me with the framework and tools for negotiating new spaces and instilling in me the importance of continual relationship building that must be done on a personal and professional level. So for a long time, when I started in this profession, I thought that archives only existed in institutions, that an archive was with a capital A. It was a brick and mortar. So it was a public or academic library, museum, government archive, or private organization. When I started working in archives, I never questioned the traditional models in which people or organizations gave or entrusted their materials to one of those spaces. And I never imagined that there would be those who wish not to be represented in these institutions if asked, particularly because many of those institutions have resources and capacity to house, organize, and make accessible archival materials. But I have since discovered that dignity, trust, and the power to choose and control one's own legacy matters more. So this realization helped me to understand and question the sustainability and the politics of around archival repositories. I started to expand my conception of what an archive does, who it exists for. Part of the sustainability is purely practical though. Most repositories couldn't possibly house or care for all of the material cultural being produced today, even if they wanted to collect it all. The capacity just isn't there. This means that archival institutions have to make tough decisions on what they can and cannot accept. Unfortunately, this has created a significant ethical concern around whose history gets preserved and why. And as Stephen says a lot, archives by their very nature are exclusionary. So which is why it is important to envision alternative ways for archiving, and why archival literacy is so important, which is one of the tenets that NAP really functions from, especially when it comes to material culture created in Black spaces, because greater awareness and advocacy will ensure that we are part of the historic record if we choose. What I love about the idea of archiving without borders is that it allows us to reframe how we think about archiving and empowers us all to be more engaged. I have worked in many different archival institutions, including the private academic library I'm currently at. And one of the most restricting factors is that I have to think about the mission of that repository and fit everything I do into it. And although this is not inherently a negative thing, it does denote ways in which I approach developing collections, the donors I engage with, the funds I use to purchase materials. It all has to fit within the mission and scope of a collection development policy of whatever institution I'm working at. And because of this, there are times when that makes it hard for me to advocate for the communities that I work for. So disrupting patterns that document and preserve singular points of view, and by acknowledging that archives have the power to impose a narrative of the past, has been the main catalyst for archiving without borders for us at the Nomadic Archivists Project, which is why we actually created this project. And I look forward to, I'm going to hand it over to Stephen to talk a little bit about his journey. But I definitely look forward to talking a lot more about what we do at the Nomadic Archivists Project. I think you're still muted, Stephen.
I was trying to be professional by muting myself. So I want to thank you, Miranda, for laying that out. And I wanted to say, you see two quotes on the screen here. I've been to the future and I know someone is looking for you. That's me. I've been to the future and I know someone's looking for you. Now, what will you do with that call? How will you meet that call? What kinds of things what kind of response would you have, and what kinds of things would you save so that they can find you? It's important to think about. This is how I often begin a conversation about Black people and archives. My work at the Schomburg was like being in graduate school for like 20 years, in a good way. By that, I mean I was taught by ethical, engaging archivists and curators, many of whom were community activists. They knew what the stakes were intimately about the value of archives as evidence. They knew that including Black voices into formerly and largely white spaces meant that the narrative around Black pathology will change, and it is happening as we speak. I came across archives through being interested in family history. I was born in Ohio, but both sides of my family have deep Southern roots in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee. History became so much more interesting to me when my family showed up into it. Not so well-known people, but as figures whose lives I would know little about in some cases, but undoubtedly shaped the man who is here today speaking with you. I am one of four Stephens: Stephen Jefferson Fullwood Sr., Stephen Jefferson Jr., Steve Jefferson Fullwood, and me, Stephen Gerald Fullwood. All of us have attitudes and think we can do anything. I come from farmers, ministers, bootleggers, and mechanics, and wayward men who roam the US looking for work and women. My grandmother's no less complicated. They too were farmers, caretakers, domestic, factory workers who spoke sweetly, but were fierce and clear. My father's mother, Corinne Isaac Fullwood, had a nice lilt in her voice that made her sound very sweet, but you shouldn't have mistaken that for weakness. She could wield a shotgun, and story goes, my father loves to tell this story, that there was a snake outside near her children, and that she runs in the house, grabs her gun, and shoots the head off of the snake. My father belly laughs all the time telling that story. He was there. My family means as much to me as any historical figure, maybe more. After spending 19 years, 3 months, and 24 days at the Schomburg Center, learning about Africa and the African diaspora, it was important to me is learn as much as I could about my own family, that I couldn't know more about James Baldwin, who had the pleasure of helping to process his papers, Lorraine Hansberry, who also had an opportunity to work on her papers, than I did about my own mother's history. In a recent Art in America article, filmmaker Colleen Smith stated that post-slavery, Black people had a very communal ethic tied to a refusal to be in alignment with a system that kept us captive, oppressed, and shackled. We know that part of that refusal was visibility and telling our own stories. Collectors like Schomburg were insistent upon digging up our roots by collecting materials buying about people of African descent globally. He knew our histories did not stop or start on a boat here, or to the Caribbean, or to the global South, or elsewhere. And he answered the call. He knew that our descendants were looking for us, and he was prepared. Only in the late 20th century were non-Black institutions actively collecting Black materials. And even more recent were some institutions thinking about collecting in their own backyards. Archives, even now, as Miranda mentioned, that I'd like to say to people because I want them to think critically about the role of archives in their communities, archives are exclusively inclusive by the nature of what they do. Only collecting the archives of well-known people is typically what people do, and that's changing slowly. Our work with NAP puts us directly in touch with our communities, working with them to meet their needs and helping them navigate the politics and policies of traditional archival institutions. We know that as archivists, our work is to make archives legible. We also know, and we also are proponents of archival literacy, and it is that literacy that is continuously developing and flowing as it flows. And we also know that alternative archival strategies, such as non-custodial models, not only help us preserve our communities, they also serve as inspiration to keep our minds and hearts open to newer possibilities. And with that, I'll turn it over to Miranda.
Thank you, Stephen. So if you've been in this conversation around, and you've been thinking about alternative models for archiving, you understand that it is probably because there have been two, as we've been talking about, there's been exclusion within the archives. There have been too many instances where there are silences, where you think something should exist and you go to the archive wherever you are, and you cannot find anything, whether it's about your own family, whether it's about a historical figure that you believe should be represented in some way. And so this is what is really sort of propelling this idea of thinking outside the box and looking into alternative models. And it is definitely one of the reasons why Stephen and I are on this journey. And I think, you know, and for us, it's also premised on the belief that it's more profoundly, these silences in the archives are more profoundly felt when it comes to the histories of Black cultures. And historically, there are many reasons to why this is in the United States, as well as elsewhere in the world, that we won't touch on today, but there's a lot of literature and a lot of people right now who are talking about the reasons why this exclusion exists. As with Stephen, for me, it is extremely personal how I came to this understanding and realization as well. When I was searching for my great-grandfather, John Mims, who I still have not found, he disappeared sometime around 1912 in Bahalia, Marshall County, Mississippi. And according to the memory of my grandfather, who was a child at the time of his father's disappearance, all he remembers is that unknown white men came through the front door one night and chased his father out the back. And that was the last account of John. And unfortunately, his story is not unique. Too often, there are no official records detailing the nature of the disappearances and deaths of people of African descent, let alone their lives. Sometimes there's no evidence of our existence at all. Oftentimes, the only reason why we know somebody is alive is because we're alive today. and we know we came from somewhere. And this is, of course, a consequence of our culture, and subsequently is why our archives look the way that they do. Archives are spaces of truth and understanding as much as they are about secrecy and erasure. Typically, what is present in a repository is often duplicitous. Although archival practices, as Stephen mentioned, are evolving to become more inclusive, the history of privileging the elite is still deeply entrenched in societal forms of racial and economic inequity and cultural hegemony. So as more and more institutions are confronting this by consciously collecting material that represents communities that have previously been left out or ignored by their archives, by addressing this, meaning sort of filling the gaps, trying to complete narratives. This is one way to confront these issues and try to change the situation, but there are many other models out there. And so when, you know, a lot of, Stephen mentioned non-custodial models and alternative models. And there are so many ways in which we can preserve our histories and preserve legacy that exists outside of a traditional repository. And some of the things and the ways to approach this is to really start thinking about some of the things that are listed here, and community building is definitely one. Community building and partnership, and this idea of shared responsibility. And a lot of times what happens with traditional institutions is they don't know their communities well enough, and there's nobody within the institution that knows the community or comes from the community or is of the community. And there's a lot of assumptions that are made. So even this idea of sort of filling the gaps is an assumption that people, want their materials to be housed in that particular archive or an archive at all. And the way they go about it can be, can be very complicated because they don't know the history with the institution and the community. And so community building, relationship building is extremely important when thinking about any type of archival model, whether it's custodial or non-custodial, actually. And this idea that we don't have to remove it to preserve it. So typically traditional repositories, when we, in those repositories, as I am in one now, typically become the holder of the material. So we own, those institutions own the physical items or the digital items. And depending on copyright, the intellectual property may stay with the content creator, right? And so having that physical ownership is really powerful. And if you're in an institution where you can actually give access to the people who are most connected to that material or the material represents, that can create even more issues around exclusion. And so this idea of a non-custodial model, just keeping materials where they have been created, where they were born, where the people who are most connected to them have access to them, becomes really powerful. And institutions have been doing this in many ways. One is to partner and digitize materials and preserve the digital assets and give more universal access to those materials, but keeping the physical items with the communities or the people who have created it. Another approach is to work with organizations like the Nomadic Archivists Project, who can really work with different, as Linda mentioned earlier, we really think about it from a grassroots model. So people typically approach us. They have questions about their legacy. They have questions about what they want to do, and then they actually have answers to where they want to see, their materials in the next 100 years, like who they want it to be available too. And so when we try to help bridge what they're sort of thinking about and the possibilities around that, and with other repositories if they're interested in that, or with keeping it where it is and trying to figure out like what kind of resources are needed to keep the materials within that space. And that could be partnering with an organization where an organization could come up with a grant or extra funding to help preserve the material, but not actually remove it. So this idea of alternatives to just the taking and depositing in a traditional institution, there's so many ways around that. But the biggest thing really, it starts with just conversation and relationship building. It really does. It's too fast. Otherwise, anything else is too fast, and typically the assumptions are wrong when people aren't really engaged with the communities that they're trying to represent. So at the Nomadic Archivists Project, this is why we do what we do. We founded it in 2017, and it was born out of this idea of greater mobility. Although, it's great to have the resources of a institution behind you, there's so many ways in which, as I've spoken about before, it can be limiting. And so we really love the idea that we are independent, that we can just meet people where they're at and start having these conversations, and not have to worry about anybody else's mission or vision for what someone is thinking about for their own particular history. We are centered, NAP is centered on the belief that the histories of African and African people in the diaspora is important and should be preserved in a way that is an extension of the Black perspective. And that's not to assume that there's only one perspective. There are, of course, countless, but the objective is to not try to fit into a non-African model or subscribe to those standards, but to take up and embrace the archival experience that better reflects African and African diasporic values. And I would say that the biggest thing, and the reason why Stephen and I have been so successful at doing this, again, is because of the network that we have built, not only within this country, but beyond. We have so many relationships with people around the world, and that foundation of trust and community building, even outside of, this Zoom right here, has really been beneficial for both us and the people that we are working with. And, it's just great. We have met so many amazing people along this journey, and Stephen will talk about that with some of the projects that we've been working on. But it's just amazing to hear about what people have done and where they're thinking of going when it comes to their legacy, their archival legacy.
Wow. So I'll start again. So much of what Miranda and I've laid out so far with regards to the Nomadic Archivists Project are different projects. Were inspired by much of what fuels our sensibilities around saving culture. We want to serve our communities. We want to continue exploring alternative modes of archiving. And we know that building generative relationships helps in so many different ways. And finally, rather than theorizing about it, we take inspiration from our beloved Toni K. Bambara when she said, the most effective way to do it is to do it. And what she meant by that is that someone asked her about writing novels. Is that the most effective way to demonstrate liberation and activism? And she was like, well, the most effective way to do it is to do it. And Miranda and I have been invested in this for quite some time, even before Nomadic Archivists Project. And so we're invested in bringing about greater awareness within our communities and advocacy that will ensure that we are part of the historic record, to which I will add on our own terms. The projects we're going to briefly speak about today are the Black Podcast Archive, In the Telling, The Evidence, NAP's Scholarship, and Uncovered. Let me tell you a little bit about the Black Podcast Archive. It was our first major project, and we wrote a grant for the Society of American Archivists Foundation, which we received. And with that money, we were able to build our website, buy hard drives for the BPA, the Black Podcast Archive. And the genesis of the project is we understand that because podcasts are ephemeral in nature, that contemporaneous quality at times lends itself to a vulnerability. Feeds sometimes end abruptly or stored on proprietary sites, which are not easy to search or access, or the websites hosting them simply disappear. And podcasting is, relatively speaking, something new. We're beginning to understand how these historical items can contribute to important conversations about our future. We know that few institutions, at least in 2018, were collecting Black podcasts, and this bothered us greatly. And so the project went on for about a year to collect and preserve podcasts that speak to politics, history, human rights, and equality as it relates to the diasporic experience. Of the hundreds of podcasts that we surveyed, we actually focused on about 100 podcasts and solicited those episodes from the podcast creators. And this is where, when you're on your way somewhere, you learn a lot about the territory as you're going. So you go there for one reason, but then if you're fortunate, you learn a lot more about what you're doing and your place in it. So that said, from the very outset of the BPA, we ran into problems. Depending on the platform, some podcasters were difficult to contact, especially if those creators only produced a few podcasts, or if the podcasts were, in a sense, abandoned, living independently on various platforms for years. For the people we did connect with, there was confusion about the archival process, partially as it relates to permissions, copyright, and access. And what we found often is that many people approach contributing to an archive with hesitancy and some reflection. And we were adamantly against simply taking the podcast off, downloading the episodes and archiving them without the permission of the podcasters themselves. In the end, just having a conversation around archiving became very meaningful and beneficial. And so in the end, we collected about 15 podcasts. There are some examples on the screen here: Cheers and Queers, Drum Booty, Secure the Seat, Black Men with a Gun, and the Care Safe Word Society. These were podcasters we had a really generative developing relationship with. We still have it. Right now, I want to share a couple, maybe a little bit of a snippet of one of our podcasts, Black Men with a Gun Show. Love the title. If you love the title, you're going to love the podcast. So Miranda's going to play a little bit of it for you here.
You've survived another week. Thank you for listening, downloading, and subscribing to the Black Man with the Gun Show. Now, if you've been listening for a while, this is probably a surprise to you. My last episode was in December 2019, but I had to give you a message, had to send you a note that I'm doing well. Right when I stopped the last podcast episode, let me tell you what happened. My 12-year-old computer gave up the ghost. My backup computer died. And for a time, I wondered if it was just time for me to give it up. It was, but not podcasting, not sharing information, not sharing wisdom, not sharing jokes, not being your friend and your brother from another mother. So some things has changed, like I stopped supporting the app development. So there is an app on blackmanwithagun.org, which is still working, but I don't know for how long. So if you're on the app, you might want to subscribe through iTunes or through some other player to make sure you don't lose out. I really appreciate you being there, though. And now that I'm back on this thing, I might as well tell you, I may come back every now and then, but there are 631 episodes for you to listen to. So if you just found this podcast, don't stop. Go back, go way back.
Oops. Sorry about that. So Stephen, what happened to the archive after we assembled it?
So
Where
once
can
we
people
assembled
find
the
it?
archive, concurrently while we were collecting, we were also looking for repositories that could make this material available to the public. And we chose the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American Culture and History in Atlanta. And they were more than happy to receive the archive as well as receive future donations from the podcasters who are part of that archive. And so that essentially is the Black Podcast Archive.
Yeah. And so after doing that project and listening to, I don't know how many countless podcasts, and finding it a wonderful experience and a wonderful way, it's a ephemeral way of sort of documenting your own experience, which I'm sure a lot of people have listened to podcasts, so you know what I'm talking about. Stephen and I thought, well, we should be doing this. We need to create our own podcast and really think, family, as you probably already gathered, is really important to Stephen and I. And so we thought, what is a great way to sort of show the connection between all of us, and that is really through our family stories. And so we created In the Telling, which is about the global Black family experience, and it has been a very eye-opening, actually, to engage with people from all over the world about their families. And to see just how connected we are and how our shared experience really shows up no matter where you are in the world. And so last year we focused mainly on international folks, and this year we're going to really dive in deeper with the genealogical community. So all of those episodes you can actually find on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. But one of the things that we are not, Nomadic Archivists Project is not a repository. We are not an archive, which is why we deposited the Black Podcast Archive at the Auburn Center. And so this, through the work that we're doing within the Telling, this is a part of the documenting aspect of the work that we do at the Nomadic Archivists Project. And this will then, at some point, we will deposit it at an archive. And so this is just a quick snippet of our latest podcast with Cheryl Boyce Taylor on loss, love, and courage. And she is talking about when she left Trinidad for Harlem, New York, when she was 13 years old.
And what was that like, getting on the plane by yourself when you thought you were going with your family?
Well, I was terribly broken because my mother passed out in church the day before I left. She just fell out, passed out, and they took her to the hospital in the city, a couple of miles from where we lived. And nobody knew what was wrong with her. So my uncle took me to the hospital that morning to say goodbye to my mother. And speaking about that, I still get that lump in my throat and that pain all over leaving my mom in the hospital. So it was very hard, and I wasn't a mature 13. It didn't allow you to be mature in those days. I was tied to my mother's apron strings. And so you always did what your mother said anyway in those years. So I went to see my mother, and my uncle took me to the airport where my dad was there and the rest of my family. And I said goodbye to them and headed off to New York. But I remember when my mom passed away in 2010, I was just so broken. It was the same feeling. And one day I went, one morning, getting ready for work, I was in the shower and I heard my mother say, I don't know why you're so broken. She said, I set this up for you when you were 13 and left me by yourself. Focus on that. You've always been by yourself like a little woman.
Yeah.
So I heard my mother's voice saying that. She said, stop, you have to continue. You have to keep going. And, but yeah, that was the hardest feeling. But coming to New York, it started me writing because I would write my mother letters every day begging to come back home. It was a really, really difficult time. But as I realized, it would set me up for the strength later, even the strength now at losing my son.
So I'd like to mention that Cheryl Boyce Taylor is an amazing poet on the page and on the stage. And most people don't know this, but she is the mother of Fife, 1/3 of A Tribe Called Quest, and she's speaking about her son who passed away in 2016. I highly recommend any of her books. She most recently wrote a book about her mourning his death called Mama Fife Represents. It is one of the most beautiful books about grief and mourning that I've ever read. I recommend it. And speaking of books, as Miranda mentioned earlier, we started the NAP Press to put out and publish our own works around Black archivists and things that are interesting to Black archivists and those who love us. And so our very first major project, as she mentioned, is The Evidence, Black Archivists Holding Memory. And what we are trying to do here is to, for the first time, capture the experiences, the perspectives of Black archivists globally. And it's just an amazing project. We're working on it right now, and it is due out 2023.
Yep, 23. And it'll also take a historical lens. So we'll be going as back as we can to document all the archivists that came before us. And so we've thinking about like where we've come from in this journey as archivists, but also, where we're going. And so one of the things that was really important for us at the Nomadic Archivists Project was to think about, and we've said it numerous times, like the community that we're engaged in, and that part of that community is like the archivists that are coming up right now in the field, and what are we doing to help support them in their journey forward, because they're going to be doing some remarkable things and really helping us to continue to transcend in this field. And so we've been really fortunate to have some great sponsors with the Nomadic Archivist Project so that we could run this scholarship. And these are some of the awardees, and the first gentleman you see here is Killian Kwame Onai, and he's from the Volta region of Ghana, and he is actually starting the first community archive in Ghana. And it's been really wonderful to work with him and to see the work that he's doing. And then next is Lauren Williams, who is currently at Rutgers University and doing an internship this summer. And so these are our awardees for this year, and for last year it was Sierra King.
And what we're trying to do is not only, the Nomadic Archivists, our ambitions are a lot bigger than our capacity at times. But in the spirit of community, we know that there are people out there doing amazing things with archives, including archivists, but as well as researchers. And so Uncovered is a column that we started in 2018 as a way to highlight stories in the archive by people who have used them. And so you'll see two of our features here, Uncovered on Rescuing in the Life and Brother to Brother by Lisa C. Moore, who we published these two Black gay classics that were published in 1986 and 1991, respectively, in 2008. And the Joseph Bean papers are at the Schomburg Center. He was the original editor of In the Life. And in his papers, he had all these different contexts. And she was able to, for the most part, faithfully reproduce In the Life as well as Brother to Brother by using those archives. And so we have a lot of those stories, and so more of those stories are coming. So make sure you subscribe to our newsletter. And the work that I'm doing outside of the Nomadic Archivists Project dovetails quite nicely with what we believe. And so I was approached in 2018 by the Black Theater Commons, which is an advocacy organization for Black theaters. They were starting what they called a national archival initiative to help Black theaters, both historically and presently, with their archives. And so my job was to not only work with current archives, current theaters and theater practitioners, directors, and so forth. I was also looking at the past and seeing where their archives show up in history, but also in repositories. And so what you see here is Donald Owens, who was the artistic director of the Arena Players, holding up a poster from an earlier production. Their archives are amazing. And earlier on, when I was showing you David Mitchell, who's the director, he was boxing up the material for it to go to Morgan State University, which was really a big thing for us, because what we were trying to do and what we're still doing, because the project is still in progress, is that we're working with community archives and introducing them to traditional archives, seeing how that relationship can develop and grow, but also looking at Black theaters who might want to keep their archives, like the Black theater, the Black local theater in, not in St. Louis, excuse me, North Carolina. They decided after a capital redo of their theater, decided to keep their archives. So we would work with them to help them with archival standards, thinking through whether or not they want this archive to be used in the community and so forth. And so as a part of my job, I put together a video with the help of editor and cinematographer Bashi Rose of Baltimore. We're interested in creating a video that would inspire theater practitioners and professionals to think about their archives. And so this is a rough cut, so be kind to me. And we're gonna show it to you right now.
We have always told our stories. By doing so, we preserve our stories. And we have always passed these stories down. Black theater has held Black stories for decades. Storytellers holding memory, educating, and entertaining us on stage. But what happens to Black theater records? Where are they archived? Let's start here. What exactly is an archive? It depends on the situation. An archive could be a collection of historical documents, records or annals, a place or a store, or a record office like a library. Your Black theater records could be in the office, in the closet, in the basement, in storage, or where you least expect it. Black theater records encompass a range of materials. They could be things you referred to daily, items you use to create productions. Here is a general list of things that comprise theater records: administrative files, agendas and annual reports, correspondence, costumes, films, videos, lighting cues, property deeds, scripts, and ticket stubs. Black theater deserves to be preserved so that future generations know what happened here. There are a number of institutions that collect and preserve Black theater records. Some are public institutions, such as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Other institutions include libraries and archives, colleges and universities, and now, you. Where is your archive? What's in it? What kinds of things do you have that tell your Black theater story? Visit an archive today, in person or online. Make an appointment with an archivist. Research a theater collection. See what items were archived and ask why. Future Black theater professionals are looking for you. So, what will you leave behind? We have
So lastly, and we mentioned it earlier when Earle was introducing me, I'm the founder of the In the Life Archive at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, formerly known as the Black and Lesbian Archive. This project essentially is focused on collecting, preserving, and making available to the public materials produced by and about people, LGBTQ people of African descent. And I started the archive independently and brought it to the Schomburg. So the first phase of it was to collect from 4 to 5 years and then deposit it at the Schomburg. And I had the best possible experience with the Schomburg because one, I had a wonderful curator who believed in what I did. Her name is Diana LeChatinier. And I also had colleagues who understood what I was trying to do. But I want to bring in a third, and to me, it's when the community builds the archive, everything is going to be all right. This is one of the largest, if not the largest, collection of Black LGBTQ materials, period, in the repository. And it was because of the people the activists, writers, thinkers, who were creators and doing all kinds of wonderful things, came at a time when a lot of people from the 1970s and 80s were activists. Folks like Audre Lorde, Essex Hemphill, Cheryl Clark, Jewel Gomez, Alexis DeVoe, these folks had a lot of archival material in their homes. And so I happened to be a good facilitator and was able to be an ambassador to bring them into the Schomburg, show them the Schomburg and what we were doing. And they were more than happy to donate their materials. So there are materials related to personal papers, books, all kinds of printed materials, films, videos, clothing, amazing things. And I'm really grateful that I was in the right place at the right time to be able to do this kind of work. Learn more about it, go to schomburg.org or make an appointment to see the material in the Manuscripts, Archives, and Rare Books Division. And that brings us to the end of our discussion, this part of it anyway. And so we want to invite the community in, the people who have come to listen to us today, to talk with you about archives, your thoughts about archives. There's so many wonderful things that we feel archives can do. And and it's not solely up to archivists. You know, archivists are part of the equation, but it's really the communities that they serve that are germane to this conversation.
I'm going to be watching the Q&A. This has been such a rich presentation. I've filled a notepad, and it's also been an emotional one for me. I have to tell you, your two leading quotes, "I've been to the future and someone's looking for you." And there should be your quote, Miranda, of Hazel Carby, "A space for alternative realities and space for imagination," really have deep resonance for me as an individual and for the work I do, and in my memory I didn't think when I was younger that there'd be someone looking for me in the future. And at my age, you look back and think, I wish I had kept that. So there's Uh, I have there's a question coming up, and then I have just a quick question before that. You mentioned visibility and legibility and being the goal. It's also, as I've talked to people, been an issue for Black people sharing information about themselves in oral history, permitting oral histories and preserving things and letting people know where they are. I'm thinking of, youthful activism, and you destroyed stuff because of COINTELPRO, the FBI project that was around when I was young. And Black people have mediated their visibility in some, because it was dangerous. Visibility can be dangerous. I wondered if you've encountered that and how you address it in your work with people.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it shows up all the time. And I think that's why we always sort of think about, like, it's how people want to show up, if they do or if they don't. I mean, there's a lot of people, we encountered this just with, as Stephen was talking about, with the Black Podcast Archive. There's so much rich content out there, but when we started talking to people about preserving it in a way that's permanent, and it becomes really permanent once it's part of a repository, whereas online it's ephemeral. I mean, it can be taken down, and it could take a lot to actually find again. And so a lot of people reserve that right to be forgotten, and to protect themselves for whatever the reasonings. And I think that's a part of, that's a part of the discussion, and that's definitely something to be honored. And I think there's a lot, I think Stephen can talk about this a lot with the In the Life archive as well. There's a lot of reasons why people do not want to be identified, and don't want to be a part of the permanent record, and that's valid. And it's just, I think it's both, it's like, a coin on both sides, where it is great to have that visibility, but sometimes it does come with a cost.
And so I love what Miranda's speaking about, this right to be forgotten. So we embrace that as well. That's a part of, she mentioned, it's a part of the conversation as well, because visibility in some cases has meant, it's meant pain and a number of other things. And so we go where you go, where the community goes, we go. And I think right now, because we live in such an interesting time we're always living through multiple generations. So there are people who remember COINTELPRO, or they remember the Tuskegee experiment. They remember these things and are very apprehensive about working with institutions. And Black and brown people have never had the greatest relationship with institutions. And so I used to work as a children's librarian in Ohio, and one of my coworkers in a presentation spoke about this need to make sure that when people came into the library, they were welcomed, that we were holding them, holding them and taking them seriously. And that was the 90s. I spent 3 years as a children's librarian there, and remarkably, throughout that time, they really set me up for understanding the complexity of working with different people in the community and what their needs and wants are. So I have a friend who has an amazing writer, amazing thinker, who has journals for almost from 18 until now. And his goal, not his goal, but his wish is to have those journals burned, destroyed. If I outlive him, that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to put his stuff at a library, right? I go where you go. I call you what you call you. And I think that that's how we continue developing and building community, as opposed to what Miranda said earlier about having this nomadic sensibility helps us go where people are, as opposed to imposing some way of, this is the way you need to do it because this is the way it matters. We don't subscribe to that. We're very open and we're very thoughtful. We like to be very thoughtful about what we're doing.
Thank you. I hope you've seen, by the way, that in the chat, Nzadi Kieta's comment, you just changed the shape of my syllabus for a course called Global Black Family that I will be teaching in 2 weeks. Thank you for this and for everything, absolutely every word. So, and we have the, I know that feeling of something happening to change your syllabus in 2 weeks. And you have also changed my syllabus to syllabi, multiple. Makiba Foster asks, says, great work, thank you. Do you see the podcast as an alternative to traditional oral histories where podcasts allow for a richer but less formal kind of telling?
So Makiba is the Library Regional Manager for the African American Research Library and Cultural Center, and she is one of the former colleagues at the Schomburg Center as well. Thank you, Makiba, for asking that question. And very briefly, I think of podcasts more as a technology. So I don't think it replaces the oral history. I think people do oral histories with podcasting. I see it the way technologies over the years have always found their place, right? So film didn't kill photography, television didn't kill radio. They just found different ways to live, you know, in some cases. And so I'm okay with people who do traditional oral histories in terms of recording them, transcribing them, and so forth, or people doing them on podcast. So I like it. I don't think it replaces it.
We're open for other questions, but I want to ask you, or maybe sort of unpack a little more this relationship with institutions, the sort of troubled relationship with institutions. And one of the reckonings that's going on across the arts field, across the institutional field really, is about how institutional practices you know, manifest their histories, and they're very often fraught histories. And that is so deeply ingrained and embedded in these practices that are termed, you know, or up to certain standards or the idea of best practices, that even people who are pretty awake don't realize what they're enacting when, I just wanted to unpack that a little further as pertains to archives for you, and physical archives, first of all, and then you mentioned welcome and the whole notion of physical welcome, Stephen, but in other ways.
Yeah. Miranda?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard. I think what you're saying is true. Like once you get into an institution, it's really hard to see outside of it and to see what it's really hard to see like all the mechanisms at play in the history of that institution, especially if you're coming to the institution new, in that city, that community, as somebody new, an outsider. It's hard to see everything that's going on with it. And I think one of the things, I know for me at the University of Rochester, one of the things that has really been hard for us over the years is that the university, like many universities, has had a really, really complicated relationship with the community, with the Rochester community. And so we come in, you know, as archivists and really thinking about like how we want to make connections with people and to build these relationships, but all they see is the University of Rochester and that history and that pain, and all they see is, you know, the destruction that the university has caused over and over and over again. And it becomes really difficult then to say, you know, yes, we are of the university, but we're different. And the reality is, although you may individually think you're different, you're really not if you're still upholding the values of the university. If you are, you know, you're there for a couple of years, maybe even more than that, you build a relationship, but then you leave. And then what happens after that? You know, everything that you do becomes the property of the university to do what they want in terms of that relationship, in terms of the papers that that you've been working with that particular person or community or organization with. And so it becomes, you know, it is really, it's good to sort of think critically about the work that you're doing and think about how you're doing it and sort of what is archivist, what your legacy will be in this conversation as well, because as an archivist, as a curator, as a librarian, we make decisions that become part of the archives as well. And so if you're working with someone, if you're processing someone's papers, and you're thinking about like the current standards that you're imposing on the description, on the intellectual description of those materials, or even the physical ways in which you're preserving those materials, you are a part, you're a part of the archives. You are making conscious and unconscious decisions that will have an impact on the future and it could be positive, it could be negative. And so it's really good to think critically about your role and to not underestimate the power of the institution that you're in, and to really think holistically, I think is really, really important. Otherwise, you'll be, you know, there's too many blinders up and you won't see really what's going on, and you won't really understand why you're running into issues when you're talking to people or trying to do something, or when someone calls you out on something.
And then to your point, Miranda, folks become more defensive and then nothing's done. Because then you get caught up in that. And so I gave a talk with the Rochester Public Library recently, a few months ago. And what I was doing was sort of talking about the politics of sort of working with their Black community, right? And I didn't approach it from a DEI perspective. I never do. I approach it from this is your mission statement. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And a friend of mine, Zakia Collier, who is a digital archivist at the Schomburg Center, just an all-out dynamic archivist, the kind of person you just want around. Just really great, and a great spades player. I got a quote from her that I think is really useful when it comes to institutions that are trying to do work that really fulfills their mission statements. What she says is, community building is 24/7, not just 9 to 5. It's not just about building better, more inclusive collections, but about building a better world, one in which everyone has access to a full life, and better, more inclusive collections will follow. The sustainability of a local Black communities must come first, and collection building second. Pretty much anything else is extractive. And I'm not sure how that landed, but I'm hoping, I actually said it twice, because I was like, think about what it is that you're engaging when people talk about, we're trying to be more inclusive, we're looking at our practices and so forth. I'm a pretty optimistic person in general, but I know that institutions first and foremost are there to maintain themselves. So if the language of the day is DEI, let's see what the language is in, I don't know, whenever the Black Lives Matter signs come out of the window. Let's just think about, it won't be a moment. And I kept telling them, you can be inspired by the moment, but don't stay there. You know, keep moving, you know, and there's going to be some fissures and ruptures, and it's going to be painful because you might be so wedded to a particular way of being in the world or seeing things that everything else seems like it's an affront. And we've seen it countless times throughout the last 4 or 5 years where people were trying to do different things. And also a lot of people who've gone into institutions as DEI consultants and then leaving in disgust and so forth, because they weren't able to really enact the very things that the institution says they want to do, but in real time, they weren't ready to make those changes.
And one of the things that I really like about being a part of the Nomadic Archivists Project is that, you know, when I can just freely talk to people, and I think Stephen's, his point about the moment is really crucial when you're talking to people about archives, because it's not always clear. Sort of, Linda, were you talking about like you wish you could go back in time and save things? And so, you know, I always try to get people to see it's not about like where you know, somebody might approach you, you know, because typically somebody, institution might approach somebody and then they're questioning, you know, whether they should go with that institution or not. But it's not about like that particular, it's not about this particular moment, this particular institution. I really try to like talk to people about where do you want to be, where do you want your legacy to show up 100 years from now? Like really think into the future, like think past this moment, think past this time period, this one institution, and really think about the future and where you want people to sort of find you. And get people to really think, to take that long lens. And I think getting out of the moment, as Stephen was saying, is very critical when you're thinking about archives, because archives should not be just about the moment that we're in. They can be, but it shouldn't just center on that.
That's really thoughtful responses. Thank you. We have a question from Nzadi. Sustainability and dependence on grant funding is always a concern for community-based programs. Any remarks about trends in archival funding of this sort? That's the first question. And then she has a second.
Oh, so I noticed over the last 10 years, maybe 12 years now, there are trends in the archive world to find hidden collections. And hidden collections are basically collections nobody wanted at this point, but now are looking to diversify their collections or have those things in their institutions. And so that has impacted the way grant funding has, and this is only my opinion, the way that grant funding has also moved into community-based institutions, where they're now asking, do you the grants for community-based institutions that focus on their archival legacies? And so I'm noticing more of that sort of thing going on. So there is a trend. There's a Mellon grant, and there are other grants as well that community-based organizations can apply for, and it helps them get a handle on their archives. They might even be able to digitize some of the more important things as well, but it's all about preservation for some of the grants that I see coming out for the last, more or less, I said 12 years, but the trend has been winding around. And so community-based organizations are so busy trying to stay alive at times, they're not really thinking about archives. So I welcome it. And from what I see, I don't know if this is completely true, they give a lot of space to this, you know, you've got to meet the grant requirements, but there's still some space in there to bring in folks to consult and help you, help community-based organizations really get a handle on what they have. So I love that. And actually, I wrote a grant in 2000, I believe 2001. It was a heritage grant, New York State heritage grant, to do an oral history with the early members of the Gay Men of African Descent, which is an organization in 1986. Their archives were really light in the earlier years and heavier maybe after 92, when they started to get a lot of grants and they produced a lot of materials. So we really wanted to preserve and capture that, I hate the word capture. We wanted to preserve stories and so we work with some of the founders and the early people who were there earlier. So that became a part of the archival collection that is now at the Schomburg. And that's a community-based organization. And they were able to get that grant as well, so.
And it's not just about preservation, it's about actively contributing to the archive, actively archiving. The second question is, my family has a large archive of family photographs. As we age, we're unsure that Generation Next will really take it on, and we're trying to think about what to do. The film Through a Glass Darkly gave some insight. Any thoughts?
Miranda.
Yeah, I mean, that's That's a hard one.
It's a good one though.
Yes, it's hard. You know, there's typically always like one family archivist per generation.
Yeah.
And they're always trying to engage the rest of the family in the papers and the photographs and everything. And then it is hard. You just think about like how you're going to continue to pass it on in the family. And if there isn't somebody who, I guess if there isn't somebody in the family to do that with, then it is worthwhile to start talking to, if you're interested in having it preserved somewhere else, if you think that your family story is actually speaking to a larger conversation, I would start to think about like where are the connections, like where is that conversation picking up somewhere else, and thinking about how to store it, how to preserve it somewhere outside of the family where other people can engage in, if that's what you're interested in. But it is really hard if there's not somebody within the family who's ready to pick it up.
Because they're usually
Well, I mean, I was gonna say the best thing too is to, if you can't find anybody at the moment, just make sure that the materials are well protected. So even if they end up in someone's basement or attic, it'll survive the extreme heats or cold or rain or whatever, the water, first when somebody does find it and take it over.
And to your point, yes, definitely go about preserving it, but also like usually genealogists, family genealogists are self-elected people. They just get interested, they want to know everything, and they just go about doing it. But another way of approaching this is really training people up, getting folks to come to the family reunion, showing them photographs, catching them at that time where they're like, thinking about something, maybe they're about to go to school and they're wondering what they should do. And engage people in the family history stories, keep those going at events, weddings, sometimes funerals. Sometimes what will happen is that someone will be at a funeral and they see the picture on the funeral. Oh my God, I've been looking for that picture. And so you'll have that picture and you can share it with them digitally and kind of get them going. So, oh yeah, we have a lot with the amazing trove of photographs that go back this many generations. I'm a big fan of trying to listen to someone who might have an interest in something, and then bringing them in and saying, here are some of the things that you might want to consider, as a person or as a member of the family, but also possibly as a historian or a genealogist, that this is a valuable and a valued thing to become. So sometimes I think people's histories, family histories they're too precious. Someone becomes too enamored of a family and no one else can get to it. And so you have to work with people. And it's, as Miranda said, it's a challenge sometimes when you don't see those people, but I'm hoping that they're there for you. I'm hoping.
Thank you. And thank you both for what has been, I have so many more questions, and our conversation, I hope will continue. We're gonna circle back with each other about talking to Colleen Smith, I know, but I can't thank you enough for this really rich and thought-provoking presentation. It's been a great way to sort of end this series of public talks and begin a lot more writing and thinking. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Pew Center for Arts and Heritage. Paula?
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Stephen and Miranda. That was an amazing presentation. I also filled my notebook full from all that you brought to the presentation, including those amazing quotes in the section. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of our staff who worked so hard on this series, and especially to you, Linda, for making this such a substantive series and such a success for us. Please come back and be our visiting scholar again sometime soon.
Thank you. It's been great. And And Stephen and Miranda, this has been just a joy and a provocation to everybody